There they come.
Okay.
You have entered as an attendee in list.
Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here. We're watching. It's so exciting for us because we're watching everyone get in and be able to view the video, or the webinar, I should say. You're going to notice that it's not Robin tonight. Robin is home taking care of her family. We wish her all the best. I get to spread my wings a little bit and try something new. And I couldn't do it with better people because I know Gina's really seasoned and she's got this all under control. And happy to have Lizzie with us here today too.
Yeah, I did put an invite in the chat to see if people could say hello. I've got comments coming in the questions, so I'm not sure that the chat is an option for people again, unfortunately, but that's okay.
Okay.
We can work.
So tonight, if you have a question, make sure you type it into the question section on the side of your panel, and you'll be able to ask your questions there, and our presenters will see them and give you an answer. The chat function, yeah. I'm not sure why, but it's not working for us, unfortunately. But at least we have questions, so we're good.
Yes.
I'm Suzanne.
No worries. And whoever's monitoring the chat will respond.
Exactly. I'm Suzanne Schlechte, Project Engagement Officer for Canadian Child Care Federation, and I'm here tonight with Gina Blank and Lizzie Maddison from GRIT, and we're really excited to have them. If you were part of the last two webinars, you know these are going to be amazing because the last two have been amazing. Everyone has been responding so positively. I know I can't wait to see this one. Our webinar tonight is Living Out an Inclusive Policy. And I know everyone's wondering about certificates, and the certificates will be sent out after the webinar, and it will be sometime before the weekend. So that will come in an email, and there will be another email with follow-up resources, and you'll have them by the weekend. And now, I think, let's see, how are our numbers going? Okay, I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. Thank you, Gina. And then we will move into our presentation. We respectfully acknowledge that the land on which the CCCF is located is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We recognize all Indigenous people who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As Indigenous people have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. Today, these lands continue to be shared territory and are occupied by many diverse peoples from near and far. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And with that, I will turn you over to Gina and Lizzie, and I'm going to turn off my camera and you guys can take it from here.
Sounds good. Well, for those who maybe haven't been at the past workshops, I will say who I am again and where I'm from. My name is Gina, and I am the professional learning lead at GRIT. So I facilitate a lot of workshops and create a lot of workshops, and it's one of my favorite things to do with educators and family childcare providers is to learn alongside you. I am coming to you tonight from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, otherwise known as Edmonton. I'll let Lizzie introduce herself briefly, and then we'll get going.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lizzie Maddison. I also work for the GRIT program. I am an ASAP coach. I am in Treaty 7 in Alberta, which puts me in Calgary. I'm very excited for this evening.
Yeah, I should have put a different picture up here because we all had a dump of snow this past weekend across Alberta. So we are loving the look of it, even if we don't like to shovel it. That's how I'm acknowledging the land these days, is through shoveling. As we get going, I just want to remind us of just some brief kind of like guidelines to follow as we're sharing together. I know we can see your questions in the chat, and whoever's not actively speaking will monitor the questions to answer as we go. It is an interactive workshop as much as we can be in this virtual space, but we know that your sharing is encouraged but never forced. So feel free to put comments and questions in the chat at any time. But if you're here to just listen and soak it all in this evening, we understand that too. So we want you to respect yourself and what you need, others in this space and the virtual space that we're on. So reduce any distractions to your learning. And I don't have my phone to worry about. It's not even in the room, so I don't need to put it on silent. And any self-care that you need as we go, please do that as you need to. It's a short workshop, so we don't have an official break, but if you need to go grab a drink of water, carry us with you and keep listening and do what you need to do. And we are going to be talking a little bit about, inclusive policy and practice and how those align. And so like our last two workshops, it might bring up some uncomfortable emotions from either things that we've experienced or things that we've seen other children experience. And so if you experience this yourself, please do take a break as needed. You can reach out to a trusted family member or friend after the show to kind of share your feelings and what kind of came up. And also feel free to send a direct message to the facilitator, one of us, and we can try and co-regulate with you. So very briefly, we're going to review the definition of inclusion that we've been holding the last couple sessions. And we're going to spend most of the time exploring some inclusion principles that will drive your program's policy and practice. So we talked a lot about some really great inclusive practices last week in your learning environment, whether that's a family childcare setting, like a classroom setting, or some other early learning setting. And so this is sort of the overarching like policy and procedures that kind of guide everything else that you do. How do people coming into your program know that you are an inclusive program? And so the last objective we'll spend a little bit of time investigating your role and how you can support inclusion and inclusive policy within your sphere of influence, recognizing that there's lots of systems in play here. And like the first workshop, we're going to be asking a lot more questions than giving answers. A lot of these questions will be questions that you take back to your team, to your supervisor, to your network of people who support you to keep the conversation going. So a reminder of GRIT's definition of inclusion, which you should see throughout the session this evening. So it's the belief that we all belong, right? So that's belonging is first and foremost. And all children have the right to participate in their natural settings. So we talked about natural settings being wherever they would be if they didn't have a disability. And that's the lens of inclusion we're focusing on tonight, that intersection of disability and neurodivergence. But this definition applies to things like ethnicity and gender and age and all of those things. And when children are included, they are active and valued participants in family life, in community life, and in school as well. So when we talk this evening about all children, we're going to emphasize that quite a bit, but we want to keep that in mind. And overarching even our definition is just the idea that inclusion is a human right. So we're holding space for that reality as well, right? The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child really contains some core principles around inclusion, around non-discrimination, devotion to the best interests of the child, and the right for them to life and survival and development in a setting that helps them thrive and flourish. We were delivering an inclusion workshop last week on the National Day of the Child, and their theme or their topic of concentration this year was inclusion. So it's a really big and important topic right now around the world. So having program level policies and procedures around inclusion is going to help your organization kind of meet these UN convention mandates. And it's there to remind us that inclusion is not just a nice idea, or yeah, maybe something we could do down the road, or a suggestion. It's a human right, and we want to do our absolute best to treat it as such and to recognize that it's essential to every child and family in Canada, no matter where they're from or where they've been. So the principles that Lizzie's going to start off taking us through in the next objective are these that you see on the screen. These are the sort of 3 principles for successful inclusion. And so we're going to discuss each a little individually, but in reality, there's a lot of overlap between these 3 principles. And so we're going to go through these 3 components that kind of make up inclusion. One of them is access. Basically, does your program allow full access to all children and families in an equitable way? Support is the second one. This is just looking at, do all children and their families have the supports that they need to learn in your setting? And do all educators and providers have the supports they need to do their best work of inclusion? So it's looking at both sides of that. And then participation. So does your inclusion policy, either of your agency or your family childcare setting or your school or wherever you're coming from this evening, does your program's inclusion policy allow for meaningful participation? So it's not just that the child's in the room, but they're actually active participants. And do all children and families feel that sense of belonging? So with that, we will dive right into access. Lizzie, take us away.
Yes, thank you, Gina. Yeah, we're now going to take some time to look at the principle of access when we're talking about inclusion. So 1 in 10 children with disabilities in Canada have been denied a space in a childcare program. I have actually been part of a program that has been part of that 1 in 10. When I first came to Canada, I worked at a childcare program, and we had a family approach us for a spot, and their child had osteogenesis imperfecta, which is also known as brittle bones disease. So this child would break a bone very easily, falling over, bumping over. They'd already had multiple fractures. And my childcare centre, I wasn't part of the management team, I was just an educator, but we said, no, we're sorry, we can't support your child, we can't handle that type of condition. So we denied that family a spot. So that kind of tracks with the data. About 1 in 4 children with physical disabilities are denied a space, and about 1 in 4 with emotional conditions as well. We're now going to watch a short video clip from a podcast, Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson, that the CEO of Grit had the privilege to speak on. And this is going to be from the parent's point of view. This is a short clip from an interview with a parent who have faced real barriers to access to early childhood care.
Yeah, and so Suzanne's got control of the
yes,
of the video. So
Oh, it's not giving. I'm going to.
you might need to hijack my screen. Oh, I see it on my end. Hold on. I think I got it.
Can you tell us a bit about your family's story?
Yeah, we have twin daughters, and we had a lot of struggles finding childcare for them at about age 2.5, and they ended up being separated and having to be in different facilities because our one daughter was having some behavioral struggles.
When we're talking about 2.5, 3.
Someone is saying in the chat that there's no audio.
there's no audio. That's the feedback I'm getting.
So you're seeing it, okay. No audio. Suzanne, this might
Okay,
be
I'm going to try and become the presenter.
perfect. You
or
try, because she had
I'm
it working
going to
before.
take over.
Oh, some people could hear it. Interesting. Yeah, we've paused it for just a second. Some people are saying there is audio. Tell you what.
Oh, maybe everyone could turn their volume up higher. Like maybe it's playing more quietly.
Yeah, why doesn't everybody do that? Just a second here. Okay, oops. I'm gonna start the video over. And worst case, if you can't hear it, if there's no audio for you, after the video, scan this QR code and You'll be able to, well, that's the QR codes for the whole video, but for the whole podcast, but you'll be able to hear it afterwards. It's a clip, so unfortunately there's no subtitles for this one. Let's try one more time. It seems like it might be a mixed, and I've turned my volume up as well, and maybe that will help. Okay.
Can you tell us a bit about your family's story?
Yeah, we have twin daughters, and we had a lot of struggles finding childcare for them at about age 2.5, and they ended up being separated and having to be in different facilities because our one daughter was having some behavioral struggles.
When we're talking about 2.5, 3-year-olds getting expelled, what are we talking about?
Yeah, our daughter had 5 transitions in 2023, started at age 2.5, and it really just came down to the fact that the educators didn't really want to deal with a child that needed a little bit of extra help, or a child that needed a little bit more love or guidance. And it seemed easier to ask them to leave than to actually work with them and work with the parents and have a plan in place that was how to help that child grow. And it's, yeah, definitely affects the self-esteem of those little ones even at 2.5 years old. She was supposed to have a 2-week transition period, which I also think that children should be given more of a grace period than just a 2-week transition for a brand new place. However, they only gave her 6 trial days, and they were half days, and they didn't give her any chance to get to know her, to get to have her transition, nothing. And
Okay, still some people, it was mixed reviews. Some had audio, some did not.
Yes, so if anyone did have problems with the audio, I can give a brief sum up of that video. So that was a parent who had twins, and one child at age 2.5, one of the twins, was asked to leave the daycare. So already we've got a bit of a barrier to access because you've got twin girls going to separate daycares. And then the child who was asked to leave in 1 calendar year went to 5 different childcare centres. So she was expelled from multiple childcare centres in 1 calendar year. And it's very frustrating for the parents. Some standout comments were, it boiled down to the fact the educators didn't want to deal with a child who needed a bit of extra care, a bit of extra attention, a bit of extra love. It was easier for them to ask her to leave. And summing up that she felt that the programs didn't have time to get to know her daughter very well. So with that information, if you were able to listen to the video clip or from that little brief summary, is there anything that kind of stands out to you from that story? So again, that is a 2.5-year-old girl being expelled from multiple childcare centres, 5 childcare centres in the space of 1 year, 12 months. Anything that kind of jumps out to people?
Yeah, for those who had the audio, feel free to share in the chat what might have stood out from that story. Or even your story, Lizzie, right? Being an educator and seeing that kind of stood out to me because, you're seeing this happen. You weren't part of that decision, but you're kind of watching your leadership kind of make decisions about children's inclusion. And so that has an impact, like you still remember it, right?
Oh yeah, because it was presented to us as it all boiled down to paperwork. Really, like I remember the director at the time kept saying, "Oh, but can you imagine what we would have to go through if this child broke a bone when they were at the center, and if they kept breaking the bone at the center?" So there was a real fear, and it was a real fear, right, that we weren't going to be able to protect this child, even though the family told us they said, yeah, she is going to break a bone because that's the condition. So they were kind of giving us that heads up, but there was still that fear. And I just see somebody in the questions, our centre has had to turn children away as they were already overwhelmed with several children with diverse needs. Yeah, that longer transition period for children, I think in the video, just half days.
Yeah, lack of compassion and understanding. I think that's key, right?
Yes. And it was strong, you know, she used very strong language, you know, like I felt like the educators didn't want to deal with her. It was easier. And those things can be hard to hear. You know, that's very, I think, very confrontational language, but think how frustrating it must be for that family as well. Yeah. And now let's switch it up a bit. Imagine this family has come to your program. So this little girl who's maybe on, you know, center number 6 is now starting into your center. How would they be welcomed into your program? Oh yeah, the separation is really, yeah, that's a really heartbreaking point for me as well, separating those twin girls. Transition. So yes, let's think. If this family came to your center, how would you welcome them into your program? Someone's kind of already said that they've got maybe a longer transition period for her, which is a really great idea. Oh, someone's asking there's a workbook, Gina, for this evening's session.
Yeah, there is. I thought I sent that to, did I not send that to you, Suzanne, earlier? I'm completely off the ball this week. It's okay. You know what? There technically is. If you don't have it, don't worry. You can write your notes on whatever piece of paper works, and we will make sure. I know I put the QR codes into the workbook, so we'll make sure to send that out after, just so that you can refer to those and have them there as needed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's just take a moment to, child time to settle in. Responsibilities and liabilities.
Yeah, there's great comments in the chat about how do we balance what the family needs and deserves with what the educators need and deserve. We're gonna come back to that question a few times this evening, because you're right.
Yeah. I was going to say, just some practices we might want to think about is, can all children attend during the same hours? So one strategy that I have seen multiple times is when centers reduce a child's hours, saying they can only attend for a few hours per day. And this is typically linked to the next point, which is if a child has an aide, can they still come on days when the aide isn't attending? So sometimes, especially in Alberta, if you're looking at the early years funding, those aides work the school calendar year, even though daycares are open all year round. But the aide is typically working school hours and the school calendar year, so they don't work holidays, and it's only about 3 to 4 hours per day. So sometimes you get centers saying, well, your child can come, but they can only come when Mandy is here to work with them. So again, they're not getting that full access. And does your program's guidance policy permit you to ask a family to withdraw their child for any reason? Again, this is something I've seen quite a lot in the programs I work with. 3 strikes and you're out. If they do this again, we are going to terminate the contract. So these are just some of the pieces we've got to think about when we think about aligning inclusive policy versus actually putting it into practice.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep working on some of these questions in the chat because they're really good, and I want to make sure I acknowledge them. So Lizzie, I'll let you keep going here. The QR code on the screen, just before we move on, will take you to the full podcast episode. It really is worth going down and listening to that, the whole thing, and you'll get far more context because they do talk about the balance between families and educators. But for the sake of this workshop, we wanted to really share what the impact is on families in terms of guiding our decisions.
Yes.
So the questions and comments are coming fast and furious here, and I'm even having a hard time keeping up. But there is, as good as the webinar itself is the comments that are going on here.
I'm addressing some of them, and we'll pull out some of them as they become relevant on slides as well.
Perfect. So we're all here because we are passionate about inclusion, and we're committed to implementing inclusion in all our centers. But this is a big topic, right? And sometimes it can feel really hard to know where to begin, but there'll be things that you are already doing in your practice, in your centers, that already promote inclusion. So I'd really love to know what they are. You know, the wonderful thing about this webinar and why I was so excited to be part of it is it isn't just Alberta, right? We've got people from Nova Scotia and BC and Winnipeg. So I would love to know, what are people doing all over Canada that is promoting equitable access for all children?
Yeah, feel free to share in the chat. We'll read out
Yeah.
some of them verbally. Scroll
Oh,
down.
yes. Having open communication with families right from the beginning.
Yes.
Yes. Those relationships are so important because, as this person rightly points out, if you have that strong foundation from the beginning, then when you are having to broach those more sensitive topics, it is typically a lot easier if you already have a strong connection with the family that's built on that trust and that mutual respect. So, yeah, outside agencies, partnering with outside agencies can be a really great way to support inclusion. Supported childcare development consultant.
Some great ideas.
CDC work. Perfect. Well, someone's making a good point about staff supports,
Yes.
and having that education, which is something we are going to touch on. Training for staff, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then just a little interesting question. Have there been any barriers you guys have had to overcome with inclusion, and how did you make it happen? So like I say, when I think about that child that we turned away, it always kind of plays my mind, oh, what could we have done? But then when I was in the UK, we had another child come who has a global development delay disorder. And this child was told she was never going to walk, she was never going to talk. She came into our room and she did learn to walk. She was able to walk. She wasn't talking by the time I moved on, but she was able to use sign language and pictures to communicate. So we were able to use those with her. Yes, communication with the parents all the time. It starts with the leaders, yes. To make a point of their programs being inclusive, yes. That is a wonderful point. Okay, I think we've had some wonderful suggestions, wonderful comments. Multiple children needing support and not enough support. Oh, that is, yes, that is a huge barrier. That is definitely something I've seen in Alberta, and I'm sure it's the same.
Yes, we have. I think that's partly the result of, all those children who were born during the pandemic are now toddlers and preschoolers, and they were born into stress, right? And so their nervous systems are coming with a little bit of that. And so, some of them might need regulation more than anything. And if they're regulated, could participate, but it's hard to sort of figure out who just needs a little extra support in targeted routines and who might need that one-on-one more intensive support. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's a reality we're seeing. Okay, should we keep going?
Let's keep going.
You keep going. I'm going to keep talking. Well, I'm going to put in the chat.
So we're now going to focus more on supports. So equitable access is a great start, but simply having the child in the room does not guarantee meaningful inclusion. So let's take the time to consider, what supports do you have? What supports might you need? And what supports do you wish you had in the past that might make your work easier now?
Yeah.
We're going to start by watching another video. Fingers crossed the sound is a little bit clearer on this one, but this is by Shelley Moore, and it's a really nice video just about the whole infrastructure to support inclusion.
Yeah, and for this one, so I'm going to play it from my computer here because I can see I have it. If you have no audio, maybe scan the QR code ahead of time just to be safe. Actually, you know what? I will, hold on. even better than that, I'm just going to go and copy the link and I'm going to put it in the chat. And if you don't have audio, you can click on the link. I'm assuming they can see the chat from our end. I'm not sure. I can't put it into the Q&A myself. But click on the link if you can see the chat, scan the QR code, and you can watch it from there. So I'll give people a few minutes to scan in case that's needed. And then I will click on this. All right. All right.
Okay.
Feel like more people had success with that, or we're watching from the QR code. QR code's there still if you want to watch it later.
So yeah, that's a really great video, kind of looking at the supports we need for inclusion. And she is right, you know, the number one request I hear a lot from my centers is more people, you know, how can we get the funding so we can hire that one-to-one support? And I'm not going to say that one-to-one support is never needed. There are cases when having more people in the room is beneficial, but the trap you can fall into if you do hire that one-on-one person, that one-to-one support, is that the other educators in the room can then be like, oh, great, this is fantastic. I don't have to worry about Ben anymore because now Mandy is here and Mandy looks after Ben. So it can kind of turn people off the potential to learn and grow their skills if we default to that one-to-one support. So let's have a look at some of those structural supports that we have. There are child level supports and there are professional supports. Let's focus on the child level ones first. This is anything that is meant to support the child's participation. And it's everything that has been discussed in previous workshops as well. The biggest thing we can do is connection, meaningful connections with every child every day. Even the ones that it can be difficult to connect with. Again, when I worked in the UK, I had a child that was a biter. She would bite multiple times a day. One time she bit the same child 7 times in one day. That was not a fun conversation to have with either of those families. And it would be tempting, right, to kind of hang back when she wasn't biting, to be like, whew, have a bit of downtime from following this biting child around. But that's when I connected with her the most, because you don't want to have that relationship when all you are to the child is don't do this, stop doing that. You want to have positive interactions as well to build that trust and that strong foundation relationship. Physical access. You know, can the children get into your building? Can they access the play spaces that the other children can get into? If they're older and they're using the toilet, how is that situation? Can they go to the bathroom and maintain that dignity? Visual supports at Grit and ASAP, we love visuals. Is there a visual scheduler? Are there routines broken down to help those step-by-step transitions? I was in a center yesterday and they have a child who really struggles with eating. He stuffs everything in his mouth. He tries to swallow it all at once. He's choked a couple of times. It's very stressful. So they've broken it down into a visual for him. You take one piece of food, you put it in your mouth, you chew, you swallow, then you can take another piece of food. Do we have inclusion-friendly materials, social stories, fidgets for circle time? You know, when I go to a center and I watch a circle time, I've got so many children that might have to have a little fidget cushion to sit on or a fidget toy to keep their hands busy so they can join in with this large group time. And do we have those regulating spaces when things get too much and it's overwhelming and they're moving into that red zone? Is there a space they can go to calm down with somebody to regulate and get back into a mindset where they're ready to learn? And then we have our professional supports. This can be things like universal screening tools, such as the Ages and Stages questionnaire. If you use these with all families, it can prevent some families from feeling targeted. So again, some of the centers I work with, they send these Ages and Stages home once or twice a year to everybody. And I've used them with my children as well. I love the Ages and Stages. They kind of give me a baseline of what I should be looking at with my children. They've kind of caught some things that I hadn't noticed. Both my children are really good at talking, so communication and language, but they were a bit slower with that gross motor. So again, those Ages and Stages, when used with all parents, can just be a great reminder to families about what is typical with a child's development. Resources and training. Workshops like this are a great resource. Have a look around. What training opportunities are provided for educators in your area? Do you have access to a professional development allowance? For instance, here in Alberta, educators do have access to money to attend province-approved workshops. There we go. things like podcasts as well, like the one Real Talk, the clip, other podcasts out there. Data forms. So when a child struggles in a routine, this is a way to capture patterns, frequency, and context on paper. So this is something that I suggest when I'm coaching and we are starting to have challenging behavior pop up. Let's take maybe a week's worth of observations. Is this happening at the same time of day? Is it happening at the same kind of area? Is it happening with the same children? What is going on? Because often educators tell me, well, I don't know why they did it. There was no reason. But that is not true. There is always a reason. It might not be what we think of as a logical reason, but that's when we've really got to take that step back and remember that children's brains are still growing. They don't have the same impulse control that we do. They don't have the same access to the communication skills to explain their feelings as we do. We cannot expect children to respond to stressful situations in the same way that we would, because our brains are much more developed. We have much more capacity to handle stresses, and young children don't. Remember, all behavior is communication, even the ones that we find mystifying. Educated resources and training. Now, people have kind of mentioned this a couple of times about having the supportive leadership. And when I started, way back in the UK, we had a child start in my room who was a real challenge. He scratched me. He spat in my face. He climbed on tables. He ran away. He was physically violent with the other children. It was so stressful. So I went to my director and I sat down and I said, well, I don't know what to do. What do I do with this child? He's running rings around me and I don't know what to do. And my director said to me, oh, so you're telling me that you can't do your job. And if this was the same situation now, I'm a bit older, I've got more experience, I would be able to say, no, what I am telling you is this child is struggling in the room and we've got to change up the way we're doing things because it's not working for us and it's not working for him. But I was young and I just started, so I kind of mumbled something about, oh, well, no, I can do my job. I can figure it out. And I went back to my room and guess what happened? Nothing changed. The behaviors kept on going. Actually, one thing that did change is I didn't try and do that connection with him. I didn't try and have that relationship. I was hands off because I didn't know what to do with this child. I was struggling. He made me feel bad at my job. So it was just easier for me to step away and not get involved. And that happened with the other educators in the room as well. Same experience. We weren't getting the supports. We weren't getting any advice on what we could do differently. So we all stopped trying. And the behaviors continued. And then he moved out of our room, so it wasn't our problem anymore. But the behaviors kept continuing because nothing was being done. And he was asked to leave the center. So that support from the leadership team is so important because it's not a sign of weakness to say, hey, this is an area that I'm unsure about. I need more help. So yeah, they are so important to have educated resources and training. And of course, again, sharing information with families. If I was in this situation now, I would speak to that child's family and I would say, hey, these are the behaviors I am seeing at the center. Do you see these at home? If you see these at home, what do you do and what works? I'd be collaborative with the family and we could come up with some kind of plan. And I could share resources with them. Hey, this is what we do with the children in the setting when they're very angry. This is how we teach children to manage anger. Maybe you want to try this at home. This is the visual we've put on the door to stop him from running away. Maybe you want to have a visual at your home as well too. So sharing resources with families is key. Again, I wish I'd had someone to access when you have questions about a child's participation. I've seen in the question box, people have said, my day home consultant, my child development specialist. Those are great people that you can contact when you have some questions about a child's participation. And then planning time, right? Time to gather and create inclusive materials. Think about your room arrangement. Again, if you've got a child in a walker, or when I had the non-mobile child in my room, with the global developmental delay, we had to kind of mix up our room a little bit because she was crawling. You know, we had to move a lot of toys down to those lower shelves so she could access the toys in the same way as the other children. And that leads us to another great discussion prompt. Structural supports. So let's have a think, because like we say, you're already doing things to support inclusion in your centers. So what structural supports are already in place in your program? Just start with that bit now. What do you already have in place in your program, and what do you still need to consider? So that's things like supports for the children, you know, visuals. Do we have visuals in our programs? The accessibility of the room. What structural supports do you guys have? Oh, Gina, you're muted.
I was just saying, there's already been some stuff shared in the chat as you were talking. They're sharing about ASQs, which I think is such an important strategy. They're already using them because as a universal screening, it means you're not isolating certain children. But we talked earlier, there was conversation earlier in the chat too about how we need to have that relationship with the families at the beginning before there's an issue. And so it's something like the ASQ helps build that connection for sure. Yeah. I'm just looking at time. Feel free to share your chat in the chat, like what are some structural supports you already have in place? But I'd love to actually consider who are your inclusion Kates, because Lizzie was talking about like you need the support, and I'm seeing in the chat like, you know, we don't have this or we don't have that. Who do you have right now, or who do you need to have? Who could it be? And I'm wondering if some could share who they do have, and that might be some inspiration for others who aren't necessarily sure who they can go to for support. And I do love seeing lots in the chat around accessibility features. I know one program was saying like we're not an accessible building, and so they actually had to turn away a child with a broken leg for a little while. And you know, that even that type of physical access needs some intention and planning, right? It doesn't happen just like overnight. And so having some of those structures in place takes some planning for sure.
Well, being aware as well of the funding you can access. So one of my programs has just built an amazing new playground. It's got the wonderful soft surface. It's got like the accessible play equipment. And they got that because they found some government funding to improve early year centers playgrounds. And when they applied for it, their licensing officer told them, oh, you guys were the only center in the province, not the area, not the city, the province in the whole of Alberta who found this funding and was able to use it. So having somebody who is kind of keeping an eye on what financial funding is available, because it is out there, but it's just knowing how to find it.
Yes, there might be some hidden talent in somebody who can write grants really well.
Yes, and I've just seen a wonderful thing in the questions about the inclusion Kate. It sounds like someone has an elder. Having an elder is amazing. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear somebody saying they've had to leave their workplace because of the lack of inclusion, and that's a hard decision to make too, right? Recognizing that there are no inclusion Kates for me here, there are no structural supports for me here, and we hope that program will grow and evolve. But sometimes we need to be in an environment where we can be supported, right? Yeah. All right. Keep these questions in the back of your mind. Who are your inclusion Kates? What supports do you have? What might you need? Like I said, we're asking questions that don't always have an answer this evening. They're answers that will come over time. But I want to make sure we touch on this last piece before we wrap up this evening. So we're going to come back to this balancing of, you know, the child and family's right to inclusion, as well as your right and the other children's right to safety. I want to look at an example policy, and I'll read some of this out because I know that the font is probably pretty small. But this is a fairly common type of policy that exists in programs. It's existed in programs that even I used to work in. And so they have this is a real program. I Googled around and just kind of grabbed an inclusion policy from a random childcare program. So this is a real program in Canada. And they have this beautiful inclusion and diversity policy, right? And they say, you know, we do not discriminate. We treat everybody with dignity and respect. They do comment that the family might be required to access additional supports for their child. So there is that onus on the family, but they do talk about, you know, not tolerating discrimination, racism, or unfair treatment, open to all members of the community. It sounds like a really great policy. And then when you get further into the child guidance policy, they do talk about how, you know, we work together with the family, we try and come up with a plan. Families may need to access additional supports. And if the child poses a threat to safety and the well-being of other children and staff, and supports have been exhausted, as a last resort, a child may be terminated from care. So this is what Lizzie was referring to earlier as like the 3 strikes you're out policy. That's kind of what it's colloquially called. And so there's some misalignment here, and we recognize this as a complex reality that, you know, we can't solve in the last 8 minutes of a webinar, but I want us to start thinking about it. This is the space to start the wheels turning, right? Because I love that they say it's a last resort. I love that it's clear that they have to try everything else that they can think of first. At the same time, if we have all these great practices around visuals and emotional literacy, and our building is fully physically accessible, and we have all those great things in the classroom, and yet there is this option to terminate a child from care, that's not inclusion as at its fullest potential, right? And we recognize the reality. The other children deserve to feel safe. If there's a safety issue, educators deserve to feel safe. So what would it take? This is the biggest question, is what would it take so that educators, that you would never have to feel like you had to ask a family to leave? Because we know that nobody wants that, right? We talked about how most people do value inclusion and want what's in the best interest for the child. But when that conflicts with the best interest of ourselves or other children, we don't know what to do. And some have shared some great resources. There's someone who talked about having a childcare support consultant, right? In Alberta, we do have an inclusive childcare program across the province. It's been a new way of doing things over the last couple of years than supported childcare used to be. But there is that coaching support there as well. We're talking about elders. But what would it take to uphold the access, support, and participation of every child and family? And I think about that parent we listened to in the video at the beginning. Her child had been kicked out of 5 daycares, and at some point we have to realize that that's, you know, that says a lot about the support that educators feel they receive, but it leaves a huge impact on the family. So I'm curious to know what some people's thoughts are. You can share that in the question and answer. Your initial thoughts to some of these questions. Like I said, it's a problem we can't solve in the time we have, but it's the question we always need to be thinking about if we are trying to evolve our journey of inclusion. I noticed someone who's saying in their policy that if parents are not actively participating in a solution, the child may be asked to leave. And that's a tricky one too, right? Where is the line between expulsion and also upholding expectations, right? Like if an adult came in to your program and was consistently rude and belittled you and was like aggressive and violent, we would not tolerate that. We would be like, sorry, you're not welcome in this program. You know, we would ask that family if you can't stay, and that's an expectation, right? That's just human decency. But we also recognize a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, their brains are still developing. They haven't learned the skills about how to communicate their needs differently. And so what is needed? And so certainly active participation from parents is key. I also want to point out there were some comments in the chat earlier about how in conversation with families, the family decided they were going to leave and go somewhere else. And I was actually in a meeting like that too, where we had been brainstorming and trying to support this child with challenging behavior. And as we laid out this plan and our ideas and asked for the family's input, they decided to go to a different agency that just had a different way of operating that they thought would better meet his need. And so I want to point out that when there's a mutual decision, that's not the same as expulsion. If you're saying, okay, this is what we need, and the family's like, yeah, you know what, that's a good point, and we have this, and actually this might be a better fit for our child. Like if that decision is made mutually, then we can be okay with that, and the family leaves with their dignity intact, right? We heard that parent in the workshop or in the video saying, you know, like it affected the self-esteem, and it was defeating for them, right? And so you can tell that wasn't a mutual decision. Unified openness is being mentioned in the chat, right? Constant discussion about serving and managing all children. Yes, this world is just going to keep on being diverse, right? And so how do we align with that? So partnership, absolutely.
And then someone else put in the questions that they actually train all their educators in Circle of Security, and they offer it to the families as well, which is a great program. I love Circle of Security.
Circle of Security is an amazing program. It's actually a parent program to help parents understand attachment and what their child's attachment needs, and how our attachment needs can kind of play out in our children's lives. But Circle of Security is about safety and security for children, and that is what children need to feel that sense of belonging. And when you feel a sense of belonging, you don't have challenging behavior. So that's a great resource. I see Suzanne coming. We're going to take you right to the last minute. I just want to acknowledge a couple more things in the chat, and then we'll wrap up here. Clear communication, absolutely, right?
Transparency.
Yeah. I love this. Someone saying only twice in their 28 years of working in the field have they seen a child withdrawn, older school age. Yeah, I think that's you're very lucky. You've been working in some really great environments if in nearly 30 years you've only seen that happen twice. Because I can think in the last 5 years I've seen that happen in other programs around me half a dozen times. I'd be curious to know what works so well in your programs that's not happening, right? That's what we need. Educating families as well. Yeah. Helping them. Sometimes families don't recognize there is an issue, and it's not active denial. It's just maybe it's their normal, or they're unaware of this aspect of child development. So sometimes it's being made aware of the diversity. Yeah, being an advocate, absolutely. All right, we do have to wrap up. I see Suzanne kind of smiling at me.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we could do a poll and see who wants to go grab a coffee and come back for round 2.
Exactly.
These questions are just, you know, the questions in the comments. I am really amazed at some of the ideas people have and the good questions that have been asked tonight. You know, another amazing webinar with you guys.
And I wanted to I'll leave this thoughts. Many people mentioned funding in the chat, and I think that's a common sore point across Canada. Certainly in Alberta, the field is not funded, let alone extra support for children with a neurodivergence or disability. And so definitely worth advocating, and you can advocate through letters and through the way you vote. But I was talking in another inclusion workshop recently about also considering, and this is how you can take this away with you as you reflect on this family of this question of what would it take. Consider the circles of influence. So there are things that are in our control, right? The practices we put in our room, the decisions we make about children and families. There are things that are in our influence, but not direct control. So we might not have control over funding, but we can influence those factors by how we vote and who we write to and the grants we write up for. And then there are things that are out of our control, right? And so society's views, current views on childcare, government current levels of funding and policy, and around inclusion. So keep that in mind too. What is in my control and what is in my influence? Because I think what's in our influence is probably larger than we think, right? Our building's not accessible. What's in our influence to make some of those changes? Do we know a handyman who could build a ramp? Can we write for grants like Lizzie was talking about, right? So I want to just wrap up saying, hold on to what's in your influence and what's in your control, and keep thinking about this question. This is the ideal world. We know we're not there yet, but keep growing in your evolution of inclusion, and don't feel guilty for where you're at now. You know, we are often in a tough spot making the best decisions we can for everybody that we're serving. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Gina, and thank you, Lizzie. Fantastic job again. I want to thank all of you that have attended the webinar, and I know questions are going to come. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, if you have attended this entire live webinar, you will be getting your certificate. It will come by the weekend. And before you email me to ask me why you haven't gotten your certificate, please check your junk folder, please check your spam folder. And wait until the weekend, maybe even wait until Monday before you email me. And in addition to certificates, there will be a follow-up email with resources coming out. And maybe we could get that workbook out to them.
Yes, I will email you, Suzanne. I will email you the workbook. I'm so sorry. I thought I had, we've had 4 workshops this week alone, so that's my bad. So I will get that to you just so you can have it to reference and to maybe take that and pose the questions to your team. I will also include the direct links to the Kate video, and I'll get the link for both for the full podcast of the Ryan Jesperson show. I'll email those to you as well, Suzanne, so you can pass them out.
Oh, fantastic. And I will get them out to all of you. And in addition, for those of you that are still on the line, we will have another webinar coming up in December. It won't be with Grit this time, but it's another good one. And that one is going to be anti-racism in outdoor play and learning. And so that's going to be another good one. I'm sure there's going to be lots of conversation on that one as well. And I think
sounds good.
Yeah,
yeah. Well, Gina and Lizzie, you can come.
Oh, I'd love to.
I might.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just another intersection of inclusion, right? It's yeah.
That's
right.
A
topic I've thought of intentionally. I'd love to learn more.
Okay. So
well, thank you for being a resource. Thank you to the Child Care Federation of Canada, because that's one of your inclusion Kates.
Well, that is our pleasure to do that. And just going to click that, and we are going to end the webinar. And good night, everyone.